My name is Aisha Raza, and at 20 years old, I opened the email that changed the direction of my life. I should have been elated, the kind of giddy that makes your hands shake and your breath stumble. Instead, I felt a still, precise kind of anger, surgical, almost clinical, as if something inside me had finally chosen where to cut. My sister Sana had spent the last 2 years telling anyone who would listen that I was too stupid for pre-med, that I should give up on those Hopkins daydreams and settle for something realistic. She said it with a laugh at family dinners and a roll of her eyes during Eid, with side comments slipped to relatives who repeated them back to me like gossip wrapped in concern. And in that moment, staring at the subject line, "Congratulations from Johns Hopkins University," I realized the painful truth I'd been dodging. Sana didn't just doubt me. She needed me to fail because my success would expose the hollowness of everything she built her identity on. If you've ever felt dismissed or belittled by the people who were supposed to be your safety net, hit that like button and subscribe to join thousands of others who know that sometimes the deepest cuts come from the same hands that tuck you in. Your support means everything as I share what happened next. Because what looks like luck in a screenshot was forged in late nights, cheap coffee, and a ledger of small humiliations I pretended not to notice. Let me tell you how this all started. I go to State University of Maryland. College Park was my dream when I was 17, but I took the long way around. I'm a junior now, majoring in molecular and cellular biology on the pre-med track, with a 3.92 GPA tethered to 2 part-time jobs and a scholarship that carries a specific number in my head like a prayer: $15,000. My financial aid statement lists federal Pell, Maryland State grant, and a departmental award named after someone whose portrait hangs on the 3rd floor of the biology building. I've memorized those numbers the way some people memorize lyrics. This semester alone, my textbook costs were $2,500. Organic Chemistry 2, Biostatistics, Cell Structure and Function, with those glossy covers that make you feel poor at the register and guilty walking home. I share a 2-bedroom apartment in Hyattsville with my friend Priya, who studies computer science and draws neural networks on napkins when she's bored. We study at the same wobbly IKEA table with a plant we forgot to name, and a lamp that flickers when the microwave runs. It's not glamorous, but it's ours. My parents, Amy and Abba, came to Baltimore from Karachi before I was born. Abba drives a delivery truck. Amy does alterations out of our living room, sending me photos when she's proud of a hem. We are the kind of family that measures love in practicalities. Dinner kept warm, tires rotated, chai poured before you ask. Sana is 22, 2 years older, beautiful in a way that makes aunties whisper formulas for fairness and marriage prospects. She was always the confident one, the girl who never studied past midnight but still found a way to glide through. When teachers called home, it was to praise her presentations, her leadership. When they called home about me, it was to say I was very quiet but very capable, which is adult for invisible until tested. There was no official decree, but the pattern formed early. Sana was the star, I was the steady hand. The first time she said I wasn't cut out for pre-med, we were in our shared bedroom, senior year of high school, the night before my AP biology exam. She was lacing her shoes for some team dinner, and I had index cards fanned like a deck. "You don't even like blood," she said, hunting for lip gloss in the mess we both created. "You cried when you pricked your finger for that science fair thing." I said, that was 6th grade. But I heard what she meant. What she meant was she knew me, and what I wanted didn't fit inside the version of me she'd filed away. I laughed, diffused. The way younger sisters are trained to make things easy, we do not argue with the family son. College sharpened the edges. Pre-med isn't a path, it's a sieve. General chemistry splits the class like a fault line. Labs smell faintly like ethanol and panic. You spend entire afternoons coaxing color changes out of stubborn reactions, only to write reports at midnight that will be graded by a TA who circles your passive voice in red. I chose molecular and cellular biology because the tiny has always felt legible to me. Cells are small empires of order and rebellion. They make sense on a page even when your life doesn't. When people ask why medicine, I tell them the truth. There's power in naming what's wrong, and most of my life I've wanted a language for pain that wasn't just metaphor. Hopkins was a dream I never said out loud. They were the line I drew in my head when I worked double shifts at the campus cafe, sleeves sticky with syrup. I'd whisper it like a dare when the espresso machine hissed, Hopkins. It wasn't that I thought a name made me worthy. It was that I believed I could disappear into a place where the library felt like a cathedral, and no one knew me as the afterthought. I started building my application quietly sophomore spring. Research in Dr. Ogendale's lab studying EGFR signaling in glioblastoma cell lines. A shadowing program at St. Agnes Hospital, where I spent Saturdays walking behind a resident who moved like a storm. Volunteer hours at a free clinic in Langley Park, where Ms. Rosa taught me Spanish words for symptoms you feel in the bones. Sana noticed the scheduling first. "You're never home," she said one Sunday in November 2023, when I arrived late to a family lunch. "It's giving try hard." She said it lightly, but her voice had that new edge, like she'd found a joke that made people laugh and she couldn't stop telling it. At dinner, when Ami asked how my midterms went, Sana answered for me. She acts like she discovered mitochondria. Laughter. Harmless if you don't notice how some laughs chip away. When Abba asked if anyone wanted more tea, she said, "Aisha needs coffee to keep up with those Hopkins kids she stalks on Reddit." I smiled and said nothing because we were at the table and because I was still training myself to choose the fight worth having. The petty escalations came like raindrops you try to ignore. My lab notes went missing the week before presentations, only to reappear in the trunk of Sana's car beneath a pile of gym clothes. "Oops," she said when I found them. "Maybe don't leave your stuff all over the house." I knew I hadn't. The FAFSA renewal email got accidentally deleted from our shared family inbox, so I missed the priority deadline and spent 40 minutes on hold with a federal office listening to a loop of classical music that sounded like a punishment. When I asked Sana if she'd seen the email, she blinked slow and said, "You should really check your spam more." She was careful, always, just enough to make me wonder if I was imagining it, just enough to make me feel small when I tried to name it. And there were the comparisons. At a cousin's Mendy in early December, an aunt touched my cheek and asked, "How's school, Beta?" Before I could answer, Sana laughed and said, "She's pre-med this week." The aunt smiled like she loved us both equally. Later, in the bathroom where henna darkened in floral curls on our hands, I said, "You don't have to do that." She met my eyes in the mirror and put on more lipstick. "I'm just keeping you grounded," she said. "It's cute you think you can handle Hopkins." I said, "I can." And she rolled her eyes so hard I heard the conclusion in it. "No, you can't." Applications feel like you're trying to be a person on paper while your real life is racing by without you. I wrote my personal statement at the kitchen table on January 3, 2024 at 3:45 a.m. when the building was quiet and the air hummed with the kind of dark that makes your thoughts precise. I wrote about Ms. Fatima, who sat in the free clinic with chest pain and wouldn't let herself cry because she didn't bring tissues. About the resident at St. Agnes who taught me how to say, "We're going to take care of you," in a way that made people believe it. About my mother's needlework and my father's route maps, how both taught me the art of finding straight lines in complex patterns. I trimmed and trimmed until the essay felt like an incision. Clean, necessary, no extra words. When I was done, I saved it in 4 places and emailed it to myself with the subject line, "Final, final, final." I didn't tell Sani. The day after I hit submit, January 12th, my laptop blue-screened for the first time in months. It could have been nothing. It could have been everything. When I restarted, one folder was missing. Hopkins app. Not the backups, those lived in my university drive, but the local folder with my notes and old drafts. I found a screen capture later in my photo roll that I didn't remember taking. A blurred image of my desktop at 1:07 a.m. with the trash can icon open. I told myself I must have dragged it there half asleep. I told myself to focus on what mattered. The green check marks on the admissions portal, the confirmation numbers lined up like little soldiers, the receipt for the $70 application fee that I paid with the last of my winter break shifts. I told myself stories because sometimes that's the only way to move. By mid-February, my life was a calendar of exams and prayers. Organic chemistry. 2, Chem 2, 42, chewed people and spit them out. The day before the second midterm, Sana called at 11:58 p.m. I didn't pick up. She texted, "Don't choke, would be embarrassing." I put my phone face down and reread reaction mechanisms until the reagent arrows bled into one long threat. After the exam, I walked into the crisp cold and cried on a bench no one uses because it faces the dumpsters. Priya found me and handed me a dum-dum from her pocket, which is the kind of love you only appreciate later. "You're doing amazing," she said, like a roast of the universe. "Screw everyone who wants you small." I wish I could tell you the major betrayal came as a bang, an obvious explosion you could point to and say, "There." But it came like a quiet leak behind a wall. The kind of slow damage you only see when the paint bubbles and your landlord says, "This is why we don't allow plants." The week the FAFSA processed, the expected family contribution on my account jumped in a way that made no sense. We had not won the lottery. Abba had not been promoted to CEO. I called the financial aid office and sat on hold again. When a woman named Diane finally answered, I read the numbers to her like coordinates. "There was a correction submitted," she said, clicking keys like she was peeling back layers. "Your parent information was updated on February 21st at 3:45 p.m. It looks like the assets section was changed." I said, "We don't have assets." And she said, "It shows a savings account of $42,000. And I almost laughed because the only $42,000 in our house was the number of times we'd said, "Inshallah," over a pot of dal. I walked home in a wind that felt personal. In our apartment, I spread my documents on the floor like a forensic analyst. Priya sat cross-legged and watched news clips on mute while I traced my numbers with a pencil as if they could confess. "Could it be a mistake?" she asked. "Everything's a mistake until it isn't," I said. I changed every password I owned to a string of nonsense characters. I enabled two-factor authentication on accounts that didn't even need it. I felt paranoid and self-righteous, and then ashamed for both. I wanted to call Sana and accuse her of something I couldn't prove, but I heard Ami's voice in my head. "Don't embarrass the family. Don't make trouble." I put the FAFSA on my mental shelf labeled "Fix Later." I went back to lab and coaxed cells to divide. And then came April 12th, 2024. It was a Friday, the kind that makes campus buzz because the sun remembers we exist. I had just left Dr. Ogendale's lab after a 3-hour block of Western blots that turned out faint and apologetic. My phone vibrated at 3:45 p.m. The time is branded into me. And for once, I answered without looking because I thought it was Priya asking if I wanted samosas. "Hi, is this Aisha Raza?" The voice was warm and precise. "This is Emily from the Office of Undergraduate Admissions at Johns Hopkins." I put my backpack down carefully, like the floor might give way. She said, "We're calling with good news." The words after that came in a bright blur. "Congratulations, Krieger School of Arts and Sciences, Fall 2024. Your research experience stood out. Your recommendations were exceptional." I said thank you too many times. I sank onto the stairs outside the biology building and pressed my palm to the concrete to feel something solid. When I hung up, I took a screenshot of the missed call detail, like proof that the world had briefly aligned. My first instinct was to call Ami. Then I imagined the silence that would follow the word Hopkins, weighted with worry and money and the ways parents learn to protect themselves from dreams they can't afford. Instead, I texted Priya. "They called." She sprinted from her class like she'd been fired from a cannon. We laughed too loud and sat on the steps with our knees touching, and for a few minutes I lived in the version of my life where the story ends here. But stories don't end at doorways. They open into rooms you haven't cleaned. At 4:12 p.m., Sana called. I let it ring and ring because I am not a masochist. She texted. "Heard a rumor." My cousin Maria must have told her. News like this moves through family veins faster than oxygen. "Congrats, lil sis," Sana wrote. "Guess they lowered standards." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. I typed and erased, because I have learned the cost of reckless replies. Finally, I wrote, "Thanks." She responded with a confetti emoji and then 3 dots blooming, then disappearing, like she was choosing the next incision carefully. "Hope your aid comes through," she sent. "Would be tragic if you had to decline." It was then, with the confetti still floating on my screen, that I felt the shape of something behind her words, something pointed and deliberate. I thought of the FAFSA. Correction. I thought of the missing folder, and I knew. I took the bus home with my acceptance portal open on my phone, scrolling the blue crest like a talisman. Priya and I celebrated with $6 cupcakes and paper crowns from the party store because she said every victory deserved a stupid hat. We stuck the acceptance letter to the fridge with a magnet shaped like an eggplant because it was the closest thing to a blue heart. For 2 hours, my life was a montage. Music too loud, texts from friends capitalized into screams. A video call where Dr. Ogendel said, "Proud of you, Aisha. You earned this," in a voice that made my chest ache. Then I sat at the table and opened my financial aid portal. The numbers stared back at me with the same cruelty as a multiple-choice question when you've studied the wrong chapter. The grant package was there, but smaller than I'd hoped. The need-based grant didn't reflect our actual need because of the assets. My stomach dropped the way it does on roller coasters you pretend to enjoy. If the numbers didn't get corrected, I would owe a balance that looked like a wall. My brain started triaging: appeal process, documentation, bank statements, letters. I thought, I can fix this. I always fix this. Then I remembered Sana's text. Would be tragic if you had to decline. And something inside me hardened in the way that steel remembers heat. I wish I could say I confronted her immediately, that I marched into our parents' house and threw evidence on the table like a detective in a drama. But the truth is, I spent the next week in a fog of half celebration and half panic, telling people good news while my throat tasted like smoke. I collected things. I forwarded the FAFSA confirmation emails to a folder named Aid Appeal. I downloaded the call log from April 12th at 3:45 p.m. I took screenshots of Sana's texts and saved them with dates. I asked Ami in the softest voice I could find if anyone had mentioned money recently, if anyone had asked for bank information for a form, if anyone had logged into the family computer during the day on February 21st. She said, Sana was home, she helped me order thread. And the way she said it made me feel like a traitor for hearing what I heard. I called Diane at Financial Aid again and asked for the IP address associated with the FAFSA change. She said that wasn't information she could release to a student and gave me a link to an appeal form. I wrote the first draft that night and cried into it until the ink feathered at the edges. There is a specific humiliation in realizing the person who calls you Lil Sis might be the same person who wants the staircase pulled away as you climb. It rearranges your childhood like furniture you keep bruising yourself on. I remembered the time we were kids and Sana let me hold her new phone for exactly 30 seconds and then told everyone I dropped it, even though I hadn't. I remembered the time she told our aunt I cheated on a math test because I got the same score as her. I remembered the way she hugged me at my high school graduation and whispered, "Don't get cocky." Like joy was a currency I owed her interest on. The morning I decided I wouldn't let this slide, it was raining. A steady soaking rain that makes everything look honest. Priya was still asleep, hair matted to one side like a halo of tangles. I made tea and opened a fresh notebook because beginnings deserve clean paper. On the first page I wrote, in small block letters, "This is not paranoia." Then I made a list titled Evidence, and a list titled Allies, and a list titled What I Can Prove. Under Allies I wrote, Priya, Doctor. Ogundili, Ms. Rosa from the clinic. Maybe Professor Nguyen, who liked to say receipts or it didn't happen. Under Evidence I wrote, FAFSA change log. Bank statements, IP address find a way. Texts from Sana. Missing folder timeline. Screen capture at 1:07 a.m. Hopkins aid appeal forms. Under What I Can Prove, I wrote, Not yet enough. Then I underlined not yet until the page looked like a heartbeat. I knew I would need to talk to someone at the university who could tell me how to turn suspicion into something an institution recognizes. I didn't trust luck. I trusted process. The calendar said finals week spring 2024 was coming for me like a train, and I could either get flattened or learn to run on the tracks. I packed my bag with the notebook and a folder of printouts and walked to campus in a raincoat that failed at being waterproof. Every puddle felt like a test I refused to fail. I stopped at the chapel steps and said a quick prayer that was more muscle memory than theology. Let the truth hold, let the truth hold. I was halfway to the advising office when my phone buzzed with a new text from a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Raza, this is Karen from Student Conduct. We've received an anonymous report regarding alleged academic dishonesty in Chem 242. Please come by our office at 2:30 p.m. today to discuss. My vision tunneled. The edges of the world went watercolor. I stood there with rain soaking into my socks and read the message again and again until the words arranged themselves into a weapon. Anonymous report. Academic dishonesty. I hadn't cheated. I hadn't even considered cheating. But I could already hear the way that word would sound in a file with my name on it, the way it would undo the scaffolding I'd spent years building. I looked up at the gray sky and felt the anger return, quiet and precise, choosing where to cut next as the clock on my lock screen flipped to 12:01 and the campus bells started counting something I refused to let her take from me. The message from Student Conduct sat on my phone screen like a threat dressed in polite stationery. Rain pooled in the hollows of my shoes, and for a few seconds I couldn't move, not because I didn't know what to do, but because the absurdity of it knocked the air out of me. Academic dishonesty. In organic chemistry, too. The class I'd practically bled for. My first thought was that there'd been some clerical error, a paper misfiled under the wrong name, a grade mix-up the department would fix with a sheepish apology. But the word anonymous in the text stuck like a splinter. Anonymous meant deliberate, meant premeditated, meant someone was calculating how to ruin me without signing their name. And deep down, in that raw place that had been collecting evidence for weeks, I knew who had the motive. I walked toward the biology building because I couldn't stand still, the rain pinning my hood to my head in cold slaps. Priya texted, "Where are you?" And I sent a photo of the student conduct message. She called instantly. "What the hell? You don't cheat. You're the person who refuses to even look at someone else's paper in a study group." Her voice was sharp with indignation. "Do you think?" She stopped herself. We both knew the name she wasn't saying. "Come back to the apartment. We'll make a plan." But I didn't go back. I couldn't. Instead, I ducked into McKeldin Library, the heat fogging my glasses as I stepped inside and found a corner table where no one could see my face. I pulled out my notebook, the one I'd started that morning, and wrote a new heading in heavy black ink. Chem 242 allegation. Below it, I began listing possibilities. What was the nature of the alleged dishonesty? Copying from another student? Using unauthorized materials? Submitting lab data I hadn't generated? All impossible. I had my own neatly written lab notebooks. My own lab partners who could vouch for me. My own time-stamped drafts of lab reports saved in Google Drive with version histories intact. But I also knew enough about institutional processes to understand that when an accusation was made, the burden often shifted silently onto the accused. The 2:30 meeting loomed. At 1 o'clock, I forced myself to pull up the university's academic integrity policy on my laptop. The language was clinical and cold. Phrases like preponderance of evidence, sanctions ranging from warning to expulsion, notation on transcript. I read the section on procedures twice, memorizing the parts that could save me. The right to review the evidence, the right to bring an advisor, the right to present my own documentation. I thought of Dr. Ogundela, calm, deliberate, respected by everyone in the department. If I needed a faculty ally in that room, he was my first choice. I emailed him immediately. Urgent, allegation in Chem 242. Need your guidance before 2:30 meeting. He replied in under 3 minutes, "Come to my office now." The speed of it steadied me. I packed up and walked through the rain again, the cold now a background hum compared to the heat of my pulse. His office smelled faintly of coffee and the faint chemical tang that clings to lab coats. He waved me into the chair opposite his desk, reading the student conduct message on my phone without interrupting. "This is serious," he said finally, "but not insurmountable. The key will be evidence, clear, indisputable timelines that show you did your work independently." He tapped the desk lightly. "And Aisha, whoever made this report likely has access to details about your coursework. Think carefully about who might have both that access and the motive to harm you." His eyes searched mine, and I knew he was giving me space to name it without pressuring me. I didn't say her name, but I didn't have to. My silence was a confession he read fluently. We spent the next 30 minutes constructing a strategy. I would request all evidence from student conduct before responding substantively. I would compile every lab report, every version history, every piece of correspondence with my TA. He would serve as my faculty advisor in the meeting, ensuring procedure was followed to the letter. And I would keep detailed notes after every interaction, no matter how minor. By 2:15, we were walking together toward the administrative building. The rain had eased into a mist, softening the edges of the red brick walls, but my heartbeat was still a drumline in my ears. The waiting room outside the Office of Student Conduct was too bright, the chairs too close together. A receptionist with a polite smile handed me a single-page form to sign. Acknowledgement of rights, acknowledgement of process. My hand didn't shake, but only because I gripped the pen too tightly. At 2:30 sharp, a woman in her 40s with neatly cropped hair appeared in the doorway. "Ms. Raza, I'm Karen. Let's step inside." The room she led us into was windowless, with a long table and 3 chairs. She sat at one end, I sat at the other, and Dr. Ogendel sat to my right, his presence a silent anchor. She began with the standard script: confidentiality, record-keeping, the fact that this was an initial information-gathering conversation, rather than a formal hearing. Then she opened a folder and slid a printed page across to me. "This," she said, "is the anonymous report we received." I read it once, then again. It was written in that faux objective style people use when they want to sound credible. The student in question, Aisha Raza, was observed during the Chem 242 midterm on March 15, 2024, repeatedly glancing at another student's exam and writing answers immediately afterward. This behavior was noticed by at least 2 students seated nearby. My skin prickled. March 15th. I remembered that day precisely, not because of anything unusual in the exam, but because it was the same afternoon Priya and I had gone to the lab afterward and celebrated that we'd both finally nailed the multi-step synthesis problem. I also remembered where I sat, front row, directly under the professor's gaze, with no one in my peripheral vision except the wall. I said, as much, keeping my voice level. Karen nodded, taking notes. "Do you know who might have made this report?" she asked, and I could feel her gauging my reaction. "No," I said truthfully, because suspicion isn't proof. But in my head, the puzzle pieces clicked. The accusation was timed perfectly to pull me into an exhausting administrative process just as I was preparing my Hopkins aid appeal. The anonymous report relied on details no one would have unless they knew my class schedule. It was sabotage dressed up as civic duty. We left the building at 3:10 with an agreement. I would provide my seating chart from the exam, easily obtained from the TA, statements from classmates who remembered my location, and copies of my own exam showing original work. Karen would request any corroborating evidence from the reporting party. If they couldn't produce it, the case would collapse. Back in my apartment that evening, Priya spread her laptop and notebook across the table like we were staging a war room. "She's escalating," she said flatly. "First the FAFSA, now this. You need to hit back harder." I agreed, but not recklessly. Revenge without proof was just drama. I needed the kind of proof that would stand up in the fluorescent glare of a committee hearing. I opened my evidence folder and began adding subfolders: academic integrity, financial aid, tech forensics. Every time I dragged a file into place, I felt a small measure of control return. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was building a case. Somewhere between the FAFSA records, the IP logs I still intended to chase, and the pattern of timing, the truth was hiding. All I had to do was collect enough of it to force daylight in. By midnight, my desk was a forest of paper, my eyes grainy with fatigue, but my mind sharper than it had been in days. I knew this wouldn't end quickly. Santa was careful, and she counted on me being cautious enough to avoid confrontation. But she didn't know that caution in my hands wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And by the time I was done, she wouldn't just lose the game she started, she'd lose the board entirely. And then, as I shut my laptop, my phone buzzed again. This time with a Hopkins email, subject line, Financial Aid Appeal Status Update. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it, knowing whatever was inside might determine the exact shape of the war I was about to fight. The subject line glowed on my screen. Financial Aid Appeal Status Update. And for a moment, my thumb hovered over it, caught between hope and dread. I'd spent the last week building that appeal like it was a life raft. Assembling bank statements, printing FAFSA confirmation pages, cross-referencing every single number until my eyes blurred. I'd even included a short letter explaining, without melodrama, that the reported assets were a fabrication. That my family didn't have $42,000 tucked away in some invisible account. I hit submit knowing it could go either way. And now the answer was sitting in my inbox, waiting to tip me toward relief or another free fall. I opened it slowly, letting my breathing match the pace of the loading bar. Dear Ms. Raza, it began in that neutral institutional tone. We have reviewed your appeal and have determined that additional documentation is required before a final decision can be made. My stomach tightened. Additional documentation meant they weren't convinced yet, and not convinced was dangerously close to denied. They wanted signed statements from both of my parents affirming that no such assets existed, along with verification from our bank. And here was the catch. They needed it within 10 business days, or the initial aid calculation would stand. 10 days, in the middle of finals, while defending myself against an academic dishonesty claim. Priya was in the kitchen, pouring hot water over a tea bag, when I read the email aloud. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed. So basically, you have to prove a negative, she said. Which is ridiculous, but doable if we move fast. She started pacing. We'll go to the bank tomorrow, get the verification on letterhead. Your parents can sign statements and scan them to you, and I'll help you draft something airtight so they can't twist it. I nodded, grateful for her certainty, even as the weight of the timeline pressed against my ribs. That night, I called Ami and Abba on speaker. The hum of their old fridge filled the pauses between my words. I explained what the university was asking for, careful not to lace my voice with accusation. It wasn't them I was fighting. Ami clucked her tongue, muttering a prayer under her breath. We don't even have that kind of money, she said. Who told them this? Abba's voice came from somewhere in the background. I will go to the bank with her tomorrow. We will bring the paper. His steadiness made something loosen in my chest. The next morning, Abba met me outside the Bank of America, branch on Route 1. He wore his delivery uniform, the sleeves faintly smudged, his cap pulled low against the drizzle. Inside, the teller listened as I explained, her polite smile never slipping, then disappeared into a back office. 15 minutes later, she returned with a stamped letter. Account balance, $832.14. No additional savings or investment accounts on file. Clean, factual, exactly what I needed. I thanked her like she'd just saved my life. Back in my apartment, I scanned the bank letter and the handwritten statements from my parents. Then I opened a new document titled Appeal Evidence Final and began layering everything in order. The original aid calculation, the FAFSA change log I'd requested through the Department of Education's online portal, the bank verification, my parents' signed statements. The change log was the most interesting. It showed that on February 21st, the assets field had been altered from 0 to 42,000. and the IP address logged for the change was from a device not located on campus. I didn't yet know how to trace it further, but it was a breadcrumb. And breadcrumbs in my mind were just pre-evidence. The academic dishonesty case was still open, but I'd begun dismantling that too. My TA, Jacob, had emailed me a copy of the seating chart for the March 15th exam. My name was marked in the front row, as I'd said. Two classmates, Maya and Carlos, had agreed to submit written statements confirming that no one was seated within my line of sight. I added these to a separate folder labeled Chem 242 Defense. Each file I saved made me feel like I was stacking bricks into a wall no one could climb over. But the more I gathered, the more I realized I was playing defense on two fronts while my attacker kept moving. That evening, Priya sat across from me, her laptop open, eyes narrowed. "You need to stop just reacting," she said. "If this is Sana, she's not going to stop until she gets what she wants, which is you knocked off balance enough to lose Hopkins. We need to go on offense." She slid her laptop toward me, showing me a spreadsheet she'd started. Across the top were dates. Down the side, events, FAFSA change, missing lab notes, blue screen crash, anonymous report. "Look at the pattern," she said. "Every move is right before a deadline. Application submission, 8 appeal, finals. It's time to maximum damage." She was right. Seeing it laid out like that shifted something in me. This wasn't just petty sibling rivalry, it was a campaign. And campaigns could be dismantled if you hit the supply lines. My supply line was evidence, hers was secrecy. If I could prove she was behind even one of these incidents, the rest would unravel. That night, I dug into how to trace IP addresses from FAFSA logs. It wasn't easy. Department of Education records are locked down tight. But I found a thread on a student forum where someone mentioned that a formal request through their IT department had yielded more detailed access logs for a similar case. The catch? You needed a faculty sponsor to submit it. I sent a late-night email to Dr. Ogundil, explaining my theory and attaching the spreadsheet Priya had built. His reply came just after midnight. "Meet me at 9 a.m. tomorrow. I think you're onto something." Sleep was thin that night, my mind running through every conversation I'd ever had with Sana in the past year, looking for tells. There was one that kept replaying, her smirk when she'd said, "Would be tragic if you had to decline," after my acceptance call. It was almost cinematic, like she'd been waiting to deliver the line. And now I couldn't help but wonder if she'd already set the next move in motion, something I hadn't seen yet. In the morning, I met Dr. Ogundale in his office, the rain from yesterday replaced by a brittle, cloudless cold. He'd already drafted the formal request for expanded FAFSA logs, citing possible unauthorized access to sensitive student information. He handed it to me for review, and I signed without hesitation. "If they approve this," he said, "we'll have a location, maybe even a device ID. That's where speculation becomes proof." I left campus that day with two parallel timelines in my head. One counting down the 10 business days to submit my final 8 appeal documents, the other ticking toward whatever the university's IT team might find. And somewhere in between, the hearing for the academic dishonesty case loomed. I felt stretched thin, but also sharper than I'd ever been. Like every nerve was tuned to catch the slightest movement. That night, while organizing my folders yet again, my phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. "Enjoy your little meetings," it read. "TikTok, Lil Sis." My throat went dry. The timing wasn't a coincidence. It never was. This wasn't just about sabotaging me anymore. It was about letting me know she was watching, daring me to keep playing. I saved the message in my evidence folder, renamed the file Direct Threat 0425, and sat back in my chair. If Sana wanted a war, I'd give her one. But I wasn't going to swing wildly. I was going to wait, to pull the threads she'd left dangling, and when the whole thing unraveled, she wouldn't just be caught. She'd be standing in the middle of it with nowhere to hide. And then, just as I was closing my laptop, an email from the university IT department landed in my inbox. Subject line, FAFSA, access log request, results attached. My hands froze above the keyboard before I clicked it open. The email from the IT department sat there in my inbox like it was breathing, daring me to click. The subject line was so plain, FAFSA access log request, results attached, that it almost made me laugh, because nothing about this moment was plain. My cursor hovered for half a beat, my pulse a tight, fast drum in my ears before I finally opened it. Inside was a short message from a systems administrator named Mark Gallagher, thanking me for my patience and confirming that the expanded access log was attached as a PDF. The email was cordial, administrative, but my eyes skipped over it entirely, zeroing in on the blue highlighted file icon below. I double-clicked. The PDF was only 2 pages, stark with black text on white, each entry stamped with a date, time, IP address, and associated device ID. Most of the accesses were exactly what I expected. Entries from my own laptop, routed through the campus network, clean and legitimate. But then there it was, sitting right in the middle of the February 21st entries, like a splinter in smooth wood. 1432.9 EST. IP address 68.223.147.112. Device ID Dell Latitude Sana. I stared at the screen, willing myself to breathe. It wasn't just the name, though seeing Sana embedded in the device ID hit me like a slap. It was the fact that the IP address traced to a residential internet provider, the same one my parents used at their house. She hadn't even bothered to disguise it, hadn't thought she needed to. For a moment, all the air seemed to drain from the room. This was it. The clean, irrefutable connection between her and the FAFSA correction that had jeopardized my Hopkins aid. My mind began cataloging the implications. This wasn't suspicion anymore, it was evidence. Evidence with timestamps. Evidence that could be authenticated by the university. Evidence that would hold up in front of anyone who mattered. I forwarded the file to Dr. Ogundele with a short message. We have her. Then I sat back in my chair, staring at the glow of my laptop screen, letting the weight of it settle. Priya appeared in the doorway of my room with a mug of tea, and when I turned the screen toward her, her eyes widened. She didn't even try to hide it, she whispered. She thought you'd never get this far. The next hour passed in a blur of logistical decisions. I created a new folder, FAFS, A fraud, primary evidence, and saved the PDF there, along with a fresh backup on an encrypted drive. I printed 2 hard copies and slipped them into my expanding evidence binder, the one with color-coded tabs for each category of sabotage. I even emailed a copy to a personal, secure email address I rarely used, just in case. I'd learned from every true crime podcast I'd ever half listened to that evidence wasn't real until it existed in at least 3 places. By late afternoon, I was in Dr. Ogundele's office again, the PDF printed and lying between us on his desk like a confession. He tapped the device ID with 1 finger. You understand, he said, that this is more than enough for a formal report to the Office of Student Conduct. This isn't just a family disagreement anymore. This is unauthorized access to federal financial aid records, and that's a criminal matter. His tone wasn't alarmist, it was measured, precise, but the gravity in it made my pulse skip. I knew he was right. This had crossed into territory where consequences wouldn't just be academic. The words, criminal matter, made me picture Sana in ways I wasn't ready for. Her in a courthouse, her in handcuffs. And I felt the complicated twist of anger and grief that comes when the person you're fighting is someone you once shared a bedroom with. Someone who braided your hair before picture day. But then I remembered the email from Hopkins, the reduced aid package, the way she texted me, would be tragic if you had to decline. And the grief sharpened back into resolve. We agreed on a next step. I would file an official complaint with both the university and the Department of Education, attaching the access log and supporting documentation. Dr. Ogundele would sign as a verifying faculty witness. From there, the process would split. 1 track handling the academic dishonesty accusation against me, the other investigating the FAFSA tampering. The thought of running 2 parallel cases made my stomach knot, but this time, I wasn't walking into it blind. That night, Priya and I drafted the opening statement for my complaint. We kept it factual, stripped of emotion, knowing that tone mattered as much as substance in these processes. On February 21st, 2024, an unauthorized change was made to my FAFSA application, increasing reported parental assets from $0 to $42,000. This change directly impacted my need-based aid package from Johns Hopkins University. The attached access log, obtained through the university IT department, confirms that the change originated from a device labeled Dell Latitude SANA, connected via a residential IP address matching my family's home internet provider. Reading it back felt surreal. Clinical words describing something that had burned holes through my daily life. But that was the point. Emotional appeals could be dismissed. Data could not. When the statement was polished, we uploaded it along with the PDF to the secure university reporting portal. Watching the progress bar creep across the screen, I felt a strange calm settle over me. For weeks, I'd been on the defensive, reacting to moves she made. Now, for the first time, I was setting the terms. It was close to midnight when the confirmation email came through. Your report has been submitted. Case number 24-1173. I stared at the number, committing it to memory like it was an anchor. But just as I was starting to think I'd reached a turning point, my phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. Case numbers look nice in emails, it read. Let's see if they look as nice when you're expelled. I saved the message to my binder without replying, my jaw set. If she wanted to escalate, she'd find I had no intention of blinking first. What she didn't know, what she couldn't yet see, was that every move she made now only tightened the noose she'd woven herself. And the next morning, when Karen from Student Conduct called to say they'd found something related to the Chem 242 accusation, I knew the two cases were about to collide in ways Sana hadn't planned for. Karen's voice on the line was steady, but there was an undercurrent to it, a kind of careful weight that made me straighten where I sat. Aisha, I wanted to let you know, she said. We've received new information in your Chem 242 matter. You'll want to come in today, if possible. She didn't elaborate, protocol wouldn't let her. But the way she emphasized new information told me it wasn't bad for me. Or at least, not bad in the way Sana intended. I agreed to be there by 1 o'clock, hung up, and just sat for a minute, letting the possibilities spool out in my head. Priya emerged from the kitchen with a slice of toast, eyebrows lifting when she saw my face. That sounded important. I told her what Karen had said, and she leaned against the doorway, chewing slowly. Could be they caught the liar in their own lie, she said. And if it's connected to everything else. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't have to. We both knew that a direct link between the false cheating accusation and the FAFSA tampering could collapse Sana's entire game in one blow. By the time I walked into the Office of Student Conduct, the air outside had that early May heaviness, like the world was holding its breath before summer. Karen was waiting in the doorway, clipboard in hand. Thanks for coming in on short notice, she said, gesturing toward the same small conference room where I'd sat before. Dr. Ogendale was already there, his posture alert, eyes tracking me in the way someone does when they're bracing for either relief or another fight. Karen began by sliding a manila folder across the table. Inside was a single-page email printout, the kind that's damning not for what it says outright, but for what it reveals between the lines. The subject, follow-up on Chem 242 academic dishonesty report. The sender's address was masked, but the attached metadata summary from IT was not. And there it was again. 68.223.147.112. The exact same IP address from the FAFSA tampering log, matched with the same timestamp block as the day the report was filed. My chest tightened as Karen said, "This is the IP address of the device used to submit the report. As you can see, it's identical to the one from your financial aid case." For a second, no one spoke. The evidence didn't just show that the same person was behind both attacks. It showed that they'd used the same internet connection, the same digital fingerprint, to try and gut my academic record and my financial future in one coordinated sweep. I felt the heat rising under my collar, but I kept my voice even as I said, "This should be enough to dismiss the accusation." Karen nodded, her expression neutral, but her eyes carrying a flicker of something like sympathy. "The case will be closed as unsubstantiated. No record will be kept on your transcript." It should have felt like a win, and in some way it did. A clean sheet where Sana wanted a stain. But the bigger victory was in the convergence of evidence. I had both threads now, the FAFSA manipulation and the false cheating report, woven together by a single, undeniable digital trail. It was the kind of link that turned suspicion into a prosecutable case. After Karen left the room, Dr. Ogendale leaned toward me. "This is your fulcrum," he said. "Leverage it correctly, and you'll have the institutional weight on your side. But you have to decide if you want this handled quietly, or if you're ready for it to be decisive." He didn't have to define decisive. It meant public hearings, formal charges, maybe even law enforcement involvement. It meant no turning back. Walking back across campus, I felt the strange clarity that comes when the storm in your head finally aligns into a single path. My phone buzzed twice before I even reached the main quad. First, an email from the Department of Education acknowledging receipt of my fraud report, and second, a text from Sana. "Still think you're smarter? Careful, lil sis. People in glass houses." I stopped mid-step, reading it twice, then saved it directly into my direct threats folder without a reply. She didn't know, yet, that the glass house was hers. That evening, Priya and I sat at the kitchen table with the evidence spread out like a crime board. IP logs on one side, threatening messages on another, the neatly tabbed binder in the center. "You have her cornered," Priya said quietly. "Question is, how do you want to end it?" I didn't answer right away. Endings, I knew, were about more than just winning. They were about making the win stick, making it so the person who tried to wreck you could never rebuild the same way again. Before bed, I drafted 2 new letters. One to Johns Hopkins Financial Aid Office, attaching the IP logs and explaining the sabotage, and another to the university's Office of General Counsel, formally requesting that my case be considered for referral to law enforcement. I didn't send them yet, not because I was hesitating, but because I knew timing was a weapon, and I wanted to strike when the calendar favored me most. And that timing came faster than I expected. 2 days later, when an official summons arrived for a combined hearing, financial aid fraud and conduct violation, both tied to the same IP address. It wasn't just my case anymore. The institution had put it all under one roof. I stared at the summons in my hands, feeling the corners bite into my fingers, and realized the moment I'd been building toward was here. Sana wanted a private war. Now she was going to get a public reckoning. The summons paper felt heavier than it should have, as if the weight of what it meant had soaked into the fibers. I sat at the kitchen table with it for a long moment, the afternoon light cutting sharp lines across the page. It was formal, almost sterile. "You are required to appear before the Joint Review Panel on May 17, 2024 at 10 a.m. But the language couldn't soften what this really was: a collision point. Both cases, financial aid fraud and academic conduct violation, had been pulled into one proceeding, framed by the same IP evidence, the same timestamps, the same hand behind it all. For weeks, Sana had operated in the shadows, content to let her damage trickle through emails and forms. But now, she'd have to sit in a room where her name was tied to her actions, where her denials would meet the paper trail. Priya read the letter over my shoulder, her breath warm against my cheek. "They've combined them," she said quietly, as if saying it too loud might change the reality. "That means they've already decided there's a link." She straightened, scanning my face. "You're ready for this?" I nodded, though readiness felt less like confidence and more like a taut wire. Steady, but one wrong move, and it could snap. The days before the hearing became a blur of preparation. I met twice with Dr. Ogendale, once to review the order of evidence presentation, once to rehearse answers to likely questions. He stressed the importance of keeping my tone measured, my statements rooted in verifiable fact. "Panels don't like theatrics," he said, sliding my binder back toward me. They like timelines. They like cause and effect. The binder had grown thicker since the last time I'd really looked at it. The front section held the expanded FAFSA logs with the Dell Latitude SANA entry circled in red. Behind it were the IP matches from the false cheating report, the seating chart for the March 15th exam, witness statements from Maya and Carlos, and every threatening text in chronological order. I'd added a tab for Hopkins correspondence, highlighting where my aid package had been reduced after the February 21st correction and the timeline of my appeal. Seeing it all together like that didn't just make the case strong, it made it undeniable. The night before the hearing, I stayed at Priya's insistence that I eat something other than instant noodles and review my opening statement one last time. It was short by design. I am here today to present evidence that the same individual was responsible for two separate acts intended to damage my academic standing and financial future. Both incidents share identical digital fingerprints and occurred within days of critical academic deadlines. I've never falsified my own records or engaged in academic dishonesty. And I will demonstrate that the accusations against me are not only baseless, but deliberately malicious. Reading it aloud, I felt a strange calm, a steadiness I hadn't expected. The morning of May 17th arrived with a thin layer of cloud over the city, the air damp enough to cling to my clothes. Priya walked with me to the administrative building, her arm brushing mine in silent solidarity. The hearing room was on the second floor, a rectangular space with a long table at the center, panelists arranged behind it like a line of judges in mismatched blazers. There were 5 of them, 2 faculty, 2 administrators, and 1 student representative, plus Karen, who would moderate. Across from where I sat, Sana was already there. She looked composed, almost bored, her hair tucked neatly behind one ear. Her expression didn't flicker when our eyes met, but there was something in the set of her jaw that told me she knew exactly how much I'd brought with me. Karen opened the session with procedural formalities, reading the allegations into the record. When she got to unauthorized access to federal financial aid records, Sana shifted slightly in her seat, crossing her legs as though the words were no heavier than the weather. The first half hour was my presentation. I walked the panel through the timeline, the FAFSA change on February 21st, the false academic dishonesty report filed on March 18th, the IP logs linking both to the same residential address and the same device name. I handed over printed copies of each log, highlighted for clarity, and pointed to the corroborating documents, emails, witness statements, bank verifications. I kept my voice even, letting the evidence speak louder than any accusation I could make. When it was Sana's turn, she began with a denial so smooth it might have sounded convincing without the paper trail in front of us. She claimed the device name was a coincidence, that multiple people used her parents' Wi-Fi, that anyone could have set their laptop's name to include Sana. One of the panelists, a professor from the law school, asked her directly, "Do you deny making these changes yourself?" And Sana replied, "Absolutely. I've been framed." It might have been almost believable until Karen produced a supplemental document from the IT department showing that the Dell Latitude Sana device had been logged into Sana's personal email within minutes of both incidents. The air shifted then, subtly but unmistakably, as the panelists exchanged glances. From that point on, the hearing wasn't about whether she'd done it, it was about why. Sana's answers grew clipped, defensive. At one point, she glanced at me and said, "She's always been jealous." The words brittle and sharp, and I knew she'd just handed the panel exactly the motive they needed to see. By the time Karen called a recess, I felt the tension in my shoulders start to release. Priya caught my eye from her seat in the small audience section and gave the tiniest nod. We both knew. The evidence had landed. When the panel reconvened, they informed us that deliberations would take place over the next 3 days, with a written decision issued by Monday. It was procedural, expected, but the weight in their voices told me they'd already made up their minds. As we left the room, Sana brushed past me, her perfume a sharp, floral edge in the air. "This isn't over," she murmured, low enough for only me to hear. I didn't respond, didn't even slow my pace. because for the first time in months, I wasn't the one reacting. The next move would be mine, and I intended to make it count. And 2 mornings later, when the official decision landed in my inbox, stamped, upheld, fraud and conduct violation, sanctions imposed, I realized I was holding the first piece of the ending I'd been working toward. The decision email was clinical in tone, but every word landed like the snap of a chain breaking free. Upheld, fraud and conduct violation, sanctions imposed. The panel's findings were spelled out in dense paragraphs, each citing the evidence logs, matching timestamps, and testimony from both cases. They concluded that Sana had, with clear intent and forethought, accessed my FAFSA account without authorization and filed a knowingly false academic dishonesty report in an attempt to damage my academic standing and financial future. The sanctions were severe: immediate expulsion from the university, a permanent notation on her transcript, and referral to the Department of Education's Office of Inspector General for further investigation under federal law. For a long time, I just stared at the screen, rereading the lines as if they might shift under my eyes. There was no joy in the words, just the cold precision of an institution documenting the facts. And yet, somewhere under the exhaustion, there was relief. This was the clean break I'd been clawing toward for months. Not suspicion, not whispered warnings, but an official, irreversible verdict. I forwarded the decision to Johns Hopkins's financial aid office before the hour was up, attaching a short note explaining that the FAFSA tampering had been proven fraudulent and should not factor into my need-based calculation. 2 days later, their reply came. My full grant package was reinstated, covering tuition and fees entirely. They even apologized for the stress the situation had caused. Reading that email felt like stepping into a room where the air was finally clear. Back at our apartment, Priya came home with a cheap bottle of sparkling cider and 2 paper crowns from the campus bookstore. "Victory hats," she declared, plopping one onto my head before I could protest. We toasted at our wobbly kitchen table, the binder of evidence still sitting there like a third guest, its job finally done. News traveled fast in our community. By the weekend, cousins were texting vague messages. "I heard about Sana. Is it true?" And a few aunties sent voice notes thick with gossip and pity. My parents didn't call right away, and when they finally did, Ami's voice was soft but steady. "We did not raise you to lie down when someone tries to hurt you," she said. "You did what was right." There was no mention of Sana, and I didn't ask. Some wounds in a family run deeper than the first victory can close. On campus, the reaction was quieter. A few professors stopped me in the hallway to say they were glad justice had been served. Dr. Ogendale called me into his office one last time, not for strategy but to congratulate me. "You handled yourself with discipline," he said. "That's rarer than you think." His pride meant more to me than any formal commendation could. With the case behind me, I turned back to what had started all of this, preparing for Hopkins. The acceptance packet looked different now, lighter in my hands, no longer shadowed by the threat of losing it. I confirmed my housing assignment, registered for classes, and even started making lists for what to pack. Priya teased me about buying my first lab coat early, but I didn't care. Every small step toward Baltimore felt like reclaiming the future Sana had tried to steal. Still, I couldn't ignore the ways this fight had changed me. I no longer assumed people in my orbit had good intentions by default. I'd learned to keep digital and paper trails for everything, to back up my work in triplicate, to pay attention to the timing of other people's moves. But I'd also learned that the same persistence that kept me awake in the library until 2 a.m. could carry me through battles I never wanted to fight. On my last evening before moving out for the summer, I sat at the kitchen table with Priya, the binder between us one final time. We went through it slowly, page by page, before I slid the whole thing into a box and sealed it. Not to forget, never to forget, but because it had served its purpose. When I pushed the box under my bed, it felt like putting the past exactly where it belonged. That night, I filmed a short video for the channel I'd started after the case began, one where I told my story in my own words. I kept it honest, starting with the disbelief of seeing my FAFSA altered, the sting of an anonymous accusation, the months of gathering proof, and the moment the decision came down. If someone in your life is trying to sabotage you, I said into the camera, you don't have to match their malice to win. You just have to outlast them with the truth and be ready to prove it. I ended with a direct question. Have you ever had to fight someone close to you just to keep what you earned? And then, as always, I added, if you have, hit like, subscribe, and share your story. You're not alone in this. As I closed my laptop, I realized the thing that had once felt like the end of my world had instead become the start of something else entirely. Not just a place at Hopkins, but a certainty that I could survive worse and still move forward. And the next morning, when I packed my bags for Baltimore, I did it with the quiet, steady knowledge that Sana's voice, once the loudest in the room, no longer had the power to tell my story.